recording. Aloha mai kako. I'm Randy Aki. I'm the chair of American Indian Studies, and I'm coming to you from Tongva land here, the indigenous, which is also known as Tovangar, which we also know as the Los Angeles Basin, the ancestral home of the Gabrielino Tongva people. And I'm happy today to introduce our speaker, who is Julianne Anesi. She's an assistant professor of gender studies here at UCLA, and her research includes disability and indigeneity, education, and decolonial feminism. She's currently working on a book, Tatoua, Women's Disability Activism in Samoa. And Julianne is, Dr. Anesi is presenting, will present some of her work for about 15 minutes in our hour. I'll ask her some questions and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions from the group. And I'll just also note that this is a series that we're doing this month in honor of Native American Heritage Month. And we'll be doing, highlighting research and discussions from our Native faculty members here at UCLA. So please join us again for the next 3 talks as well. And with that, Julianne, welcome.
Talofa and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Aki, and thank you all of you for joining us this afternoon. This is exciting. I'm excited to share a little bit about my work on disability activism in Samoa, and also to have a conversation about this work, and also learn more from what other folks are thinking and working on. So I'm going to share my screen here, and first, can you all hear me? Okay. And I am going to share now. Oh. Okay. I don't have my share button. I don't know what happened to it at the bottom.
Okay, let me double check, make sure you're, yeah, you're a co-host there.
Oh, here it is. Here it is. It popped up.
Great.
Sorry. Thanks for waiting. All right, so the title of my talk this afternoon is Disability Activism in Samoa, and I'll briefly highlight some of the points that I'll be working on for the book project.
Careful.
Okay, so I'm gonna dive into it. So Pacific Islands women have been at the forefront of social movements as cultural keepers and agents of change, yet their stories are rarely celebrated. My book project, Tatoua, Disability Activism in Samoa, is an ethnographic study of Samoan disabled and non-disabled women's advocacy. Their activism created 2 schools that's shown here, Ongawhi Malama and Lototomawhai, the first educational institutions that were established on island for students with intellectual and physical disabilities. This case study is also a social history of our mothers and educators' efforts to create schools to include disabled students, but also the broader efforts here is to change cultural practices and ideas of educatability. Perhaps colonialism or coloniality is a disability that disables indigenous communities in the Pacific and our community knowledge systems. In the book, I argue that disability activism in Samoa is a social movement alongside many other social movements that were happening at the time. For instance, the decolonization movements, the nuclear-free Pacific, women's liberation movements, etc. And that we can also learn much about relations to land and belonging, ableism within our own cultural practices and values, and the transformative aspects of women's decolonial work. So this, okay, sorry here. My work intervenes in the field of disability studies by focusing on understandings of disability outside of a non-Western framework. Likewise, I also add to the field of Pacific studies and their linear understandings of disability, sickness, and inclusion. Specifically, I think about disability from a relational and political approach. This is what disability studies scholars Alison Kafer defines as, quote, the meaning of disability and illness are not fixed or monolithic. There are multiple understandings of disability exists. It is a hybrid and political and relational model of disability, one that thinks through a social and minority frameworks, but reads them from a feminist queer critiques of identity. So likewise, I also use as well with disability studies frameworks of disability. I also think through our Indigenous Samoan understandings of care work and education. So this quote is from scholar, African-American scholar and Kiribati scholar Teresia Tatoua, in which she astutely argues that the decolonization of specific, and a lot of her work, she plays with words here, like specific bodies, is intimately woven into island women's activism, end quote. So heeding Teaiwa's point here, the intersection of Samoan and disabled identity construction has yet to be studied. And so disability Tatoua activism examines and contextualizes the development of these schools for disabled people within a history of education after Samoa became independent in 1962 from New Zealand. So the book traces the school organizers' decolonial politics around establishing the schools, as well as the paradox of them leaning on transnational networks and organizations to also help them organize and establish these schools in the 1970s. So I specifically turned to Samoan concepts here called Tatoua, which means one service to family, village, church, and community. And also Talanoa, which is sort of a talking story methodology, and Alofa, which is love, as sort of frameworks to thinking about this activism that also helped establish the schools, but also guided, how the women organizers organize themselves and their politics. So these examples of interactions make it difficult to generalize a monolithic disability and nod to the need for more inclusive perspectives of disability and illness across geopolitical and social political spaces. Likewise, scholars in Pacific studies and disability and gender studies have yet to adequately sort of address the roles of Indigenous communities with disabilities, and also, I think more importantly, reckon with cultural exclusive ideologies and practice within our own communities around these issues. So specifically, part of this work also is the reckoning within our own community's understanding of sickness, disability, belonging, indigeneity, and health from an Indigenous perspective. And the findings from this work reveals that much of our communities have limited resources to even address a lot of these topics around access to services and programs, but also the literature around acknowledging these various complex concepts and topics. And so the founders and organizers of the schools use Tatoua and Talanoa concepts as methodologies. And so that's what I also frame in the book. And this is the kind of utilization of community knowledge and concepts to resolve challenges in our community. So oh, there we go. So specifically, I focus on the concept of Tautua here in Talanoa, of talking story as a methodology. As the image on this slide shows a young woman sitting or a taupo in front of a tanoa or ava bowl during a ceremonial event. On her right side is the Samoan proverb quote, "Ole ala I le pule o le tautua," meaning that the path to leadership is service. This phrase is also translated to Spanish at the bottom left side here, or my left side, the mural's right side. And this mural was created by artist J.P. Pereira, and it's located in Long Beach, California. And this kind of proverb is part of the framing here that I'm talking about within disability activism. So it's a using of cultural concepts and knowledge systems to also mediate or deal with our own issues within our communities. So, and this brings up sort of very specific markers of activism that the women engaged in. So particularly the women focused on land claims on island, and they also used land as a marker for inclusion. So to a lot of the organizers, one of the first tasks that they did when they were organizing these schools was to find land on island to establish the schools. And so part of their kind of thinking around this is to find land to root, the schools, and that's ROOT in terms of the schools. And so and this, is very much related to Indigenous understandings of relations to land, air, sky, ocean, and etc. And this was their framing around inclusion, right? That even disabled people also belong in our communities. And so this is just a very brief understanding of how land is categorized in Samoa. There's 3 categories of freehold land, which is usually land that you can sell or buy. Customary land is usually tied to familial clans and villages and cannot be sold or bought. And then there's government land, which is used for government purposes. Land is such a huge aspect of thinking about belonging and inclusion in Samoan culture that there's even a lands and titles court system that we have that specifically deals with these issues around chiefly titles and land titles, because all those things are all sort of connected. And much of land claims and disputes that we have go through the courts are very much related to familial clans and genealogies of families belonging in specific places. So this was one of the aspects that the women highlighted in their activism was finding land. And they specifically leveraged Tautua as part of this activism of service through land. So so the organizing of the school also engaged with a lot of transnational companies and organizations outside of Samoa. So this is an organization in New Zealand. It's called IHC New Zealand. Um, and it is a picture of the Anian family, who were very much instrumental in founding the organization in New Zealand that serviced primarily folks with intellectual disabilities. And I believe it was established in 1949 in Wellington, New Zealand. And so IHC New Zealand was very instrumental um, in organizing sort of abroad a kind of um, movement throughout the Pacific of also establishing schools and services and programs for kids with intellectual disabilities. So on this slide is a photo of Margaret and Keith Anian. Margaret and her husband were the founders of this organization. And so IHC New Zealand was very instrumental in also helping the schools in Samoa. Specifically, they played a role in founding the schools by supporting the schools' purchase of land, that is freehold land. And this is a photo of the Anian family who founded IHC New Zealand in 1949, as well as thinking about the culture at the time, which in the 1970s or 60s, the common practice for individuals with intellectual disabilities was institutionalization. So the Anian family believed that they firmly believed that their son here, Keith, should be included in the community with them. So this is kind of the premise of the organizing of IHC, but also schools that were then sort of disseminated or filtered throughout the Pacific. So other programs,
Julianne, you
which,
have about 2 more minutes.
okay, thank you, which IHC also organized, were also in other islands like Fiji and the Solomon Islands. So, and then the last couple of pictures here as I wrap up are just some photos and quotes from the women who and the work that they did. So the schools were NGOs, which were non-governmental organizations. And so this meant that much of the funding did not come from government sources. And this really was a movement of sort of transnational and overseas organizing for them. And so this is a picture, an image of a fundraising event that the schools and founders and organizers engaged in. And this is a quote from one of the educators, and she's Natina, and she says, you know, one of the tasks that I was most passionate about as an administrator was funneling the best teachers to the school, because this is one of the ways to, quote, move to democratization, quote, end quote, of Samoan colleges and high schools here. And this is just an image of, I believe this is a float or a festival that the schools participated in and fundraised for. And this was also not so much about fundraising, but also sharing awareness and in educating disabled students on island. And then this last photo here is another float and fundraiser that the schools also participated in. This usually included one of the teachers or parents' cars getting decked out here with fruits. I think it's like coconut branches, leaves, flowers, and then this is one of the students on there as the host. And so this quote here from one of the parents also leans towards the transnational aspects of organizing the schools here and thinking about the teacher. So not only do you organize a school, but how do you sustain a curriculum for students? So Rosa, one of the parents, is quoted here saying, quote, "We got help from New Zealand in which we applied for teachers with certain skills and sometimes principals. We had a principal. It was part of the New Zealand government funding. And a lot of these teachers and volunteers would come for 2 to 3 terms, and then the organization, and then they would leave. And so this was part of the sort of arduous inconsistency in terms of how the school ran with teaching staff. There were also teachers and volunteers that came from all over the world. I think Australia, Norway, the Philippines, Canada, the US, Japan, and there were many other sort of development organizations on island who also participated in the recruiting and also the operations and logistics of the schools. So I think I'll end it there. Um,
Thank you, Julianne.
yeah, so
Give a
thank
round of
you.
applause, everyone. Thank you. So, Julianne, I'll start off the discussion here, asking some of my own questions. But again, we're open for the audience in a couple of minutes to ask questions as well. I was wondering if you could tell us sort of how Tatoua has, so you were talking about it in this specific setting here of the schools and the way it sort of assisted in sort of opening and democratizing access for disabled children. And I think it's, a fascinating story on its own. And I was wondering, how does that translate even today in a slightly different realm, but clearly related, in sort of the COVID-19 era? How is that tool and that method of talking story and community organizing and discussion, how does it transfer over, in your opinion, both in Samoa, but also here in the continental United States?
Mhm. Thank you, Professor Kiyas. No, that's a really important question, and I think Tautua at this point is, I mean, if we want to, I guess I could put it, appeal to the consciousness, right, of people. And that's where I think the women's sort of strategy came from, was how do we make this legible to our community who does not value the education of such students. So I think this is where talking story and the face-to-face value, of our cultural values of talking to people and discussing things, I think, come into place. But also I think it parallels a lot of our oral histories, right, of educating each other, and a long history of that kind of education. But I mean, I think it's really hard today because with Tautua talking story, I think it's hard to compete with technology and how we communicate. So, for instance, the women who were part of this work are in their 70s, right? And so communicating with them on email was like a whole nother like a whole nother chapter of the book, because they didn't do emails, and even if they knew how to do emails, they didn't respond to my emails. And so I'm gonna stop sharing here. And so I think, there's very specific limits that also happen here with Tautua. But I think Tautua as a framework was pretty clever in just holding people accountable and changing consciousness and shifting paradigms around the local community. And I think the other part is that the women were very adamant about was we have the solutions within our communities, and we have the community knowledge and the resources to make these changes. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if I've answered your question, but I think it's really hard. I mean, I think for COVID-19, it's
Yeah, I
a
mean, in
very
terms of
different
educating
context.
people, and yeah, so
Mm-hmm.
you think it's a little bit harder because the community is more dispersed in some sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. If there are others who want to ask a question, please raise your hand, or I don't know. Oh, here we go. Ray, can you unmute yourself, or do I need to?
Yeah, no, I
Oh,
got
great. Please go ahead.
it. Thanks. I'm curious, would you mind sharing with us what, well, here in the mainland, we have the educational opportunities. So the IEP,
Mm-hmm.
the individual program, is that, what does that look like there? Are there contracts? Is there special services that are available and resources provided for the students?
Mhm. Yes, thank you, Ray. Just to kind of backtrack, so IEP is the individual educational plan, which students with disabilities here in the States, that's kind of a contractual and goals setting plan that they have in place for teachers to follow, and it usually follows our students as they go through K through 12. So none of that. I think, to answer your question, Ray, so there were no programs in place. I mean, I think this is where there was nothing in place. I think the education system did not even include. I think preschool students were the other groups of students that were not part of the education system. And in a much broader context, if we had more time, I talk a little bit about the history of education, the sort of the colonial history of education when Samoa was under New Zealand and Germany, and how a lot of these schools were set up for colonial administrations and expats. And so this kind of puka or hole within the system, the education system around educating disabled students, was not there. And so this is where the women's advocacy and activism came into place. And they also created various solidarity movements with other groups. So for instance, they also helped create at the same time the early childhood movement, where preschools were established throughout the island. But in terms of any sort of structural and institutionalized systems as we have here today, and this is what Ray's talked about with IEPs and special services, would be the special education services that are provided in our public schools today. There was none of that. These were all sort of grassroots reactions to those missing resources that the women engaged in. And so, I think one of the preschool teachers mentioned in one of our Talanoa sessions that this is where special education started for her in her mind. So it really, I think the activism starts with a kind of consciousness and shifting of ideologies and ideas, and then it sort of moves into institutions and the kind of codifying of these policies and ideologies and in services and programs, I think is where this is starting from ground zero, I guess would be another way to put it, of organizing and trying to create institutions that don't replicate colonial education systems, but also use Samoan community knowledge and values around why they need to be educated and how do you set that up. And I say this as a sort of a paradox, because the women, as much as they were adamant about sort of indigenous education systems and sort of finessing the education system to also reflect Samoan policies and concepts, but they also worked with a lot of organizations off island who were non-Samoan. So it's a really kind of complex story here of organizing schools that that also were about relations and political understandings of disability.
Great, thank you. Are there other questions? Yes, please. Can you unmute yourself, or do you need? Oh.
No, I got it. Hi, Julianne. Thank you so much. It's so great to hear more about your research. Yeah, I have kind of two questions. So first, I just love to hear you talk a bit more about how you first encountered these schools and why you decided to sort of make them the heart of this project. Yeah, I just love to hear you sort of narrate that. And then the second one is I'd love to hear a little bit more about this like transnational aspect that you've been talking about. So, of course, this is a sort of locally driven project, but I'd love to hear, who were they in conversation with? How did that happen with the Samoan diaspora? You also mentioned there's non-Samoan groups that were really involved. So I'd love to hear about those networks.
Yeah, great.
you.
Thank you. Hi, Evan. Thank you for coming. Yes, so this story is also very much the personal and the political. So this story, was told at a family gathering. I was home in the islands for my Nana's 90th birthday, and this was a story that was told at our many gatherings and storytelling. And my aunt, who I didn't realize what a big part she played in the organizing of the schools, was part of this actor. And it wasn't until, and she sort of just told the story very casually, and to sort of reframe what she said, oh yeah, that was just a little something we did back then. And I also, my aunt, who I'm talking about, my Auntie Sina, also had a son named Miele who was Down syndrome at the time. And so this was also a story about him wanting to go to school like his older siblings, and he couldn't. And so he, I guess, one day asked her, why can't I go to school like the other kids? And so that kind of question, I think, for her really bothered her because she didn't have an answer for him. And so this is sort of the springboard into organizing of these schools. So very much a one of those stories. And and actually, when I started digging into the story, my aunt was very traumatized by, I guess, the whole activism and the advocacy of the work, and emotional. I think she was just more emotional and didn't really want to talk about it. So it took her about 4 or 5 years to finally give me permission to do this project. So and of course, with her blessing, I worked on one of the schools. So I started with Loso Tomafai, which was the second school that was created in 1981 for specifically students with physical disabilities, and realized that there was a whole nother school before Loto Tomafai was created. And so Aofi Mamalama was the school for students with intellectual disabilities that was created in 1979 with the help of many other transnational organizations and aspects. And so I think part of the conversation here are the women themselves, like who are they and what did they do? So a lot of the women were mothers, educators, artists. Many of them have been educated outside of Samoa. So they were educated in New Zealand, Australia, the US, the UK. So there, I think, sort of transnational movements around the Pacific and around the world also sort of gave them this vision that they can educate this population of students when they came back to the island. So yeah, so I mean, in terms of other organizations, there were so many organizations already on island. So the US Peace Corps, I think, is one of them that was already on island, where the teachers were recruited from. JICA, which is the Japan International Cooperation Agency, which is sort of the long arm of the Ministry of Development there, was also on island, and they supported with sort of the engineering of the schools, the staffing of teachers, of specific specialists like audiologists, cardiologists, orthopedic surgeons. The school also worked with Canadian organizations, particularly religious organizations like the Catholic Charities, etc., in terms of resources. But it was mostly through New Zealand. So Samoa's relationship with New Zealand as a former colony, I think, also fostered a lot of this financial support that is with the surrounding island groups. So New Zealand played a huge role in organizing the schools, in also implementing educational standards and teachers and curriculum on island. So it's kind of this colonial leftover hangover relationship here between Samoa and New Zealand that's ongoing today in terms of the education system. And yeah, so I mean, the the women's reach, I think, and the networking that they establish is it's pretty astounding in terms of who they networked with and solicited support from. I think they worked with several churches as well in the Philippines and Norway. So there were several organizations that they and Germany as well solicited funding from because it was a non-governmental organization. They did not have a lot of the governmental funding that went into supporting the schools. So they really became creative with how they asked for funding and resources from their colleagues around the world. And I think, one of the women, Lupe, who I spoke with, also said that the government had this positionality that disability issues and educating disabled children was not a governmental issue. It was a civil society issue. So this is the kind of sort of blowback or culture where these women are organizing these schools and the kind of culture and also reaction to what they're doing. And so I think, some of the women who, advocated, and they were pretty impressive. Like they had connections with the airlines, so they would travel all over the place. I think they had a forum in Germany, and I think the women were able to receive grants from some organizations there, and pretty much sort of there's the shaming factor of having the government taking in this funding that's for disabled children and et cetera. So the women really were savvy around their kind of networks throughout the Pacific, but also internationally to establish these schools, and also kind of just shame the government into supporting a lot of these endeavors that they have. And so fortunately today these schools are still in place, and they now have government funding and resources. And I think with more recent global laws being passed, such as the United Nations Convention of Rights of Persons with Disabilities, those sort of global transnational policies around disability also, I think, helps with the legibility of this kind of work. So thank you for asking those great questions.
Thank you. I think we have another question from Jane Kinsey. Please go ahead.
Hi everyone. I'm Jane. I'm from New Zealand, actually. It's an absolute pleasure to listen to your presentation. Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. I'm here for a year in LA on a fellowship, looking at adverse childhood experiences and how impact and prevention of them, but with a huge focus on inequity and how do we address that. And I think some of the sort of points you made very quickly, and I thought they were amazing, is how that activism and change was achieved by having that grounded in that cultural concepts, which I think you mentioned allowed the accountability to hold really strong. Otherwise, you mentioned a couple of times, it would have been swept away by old colonial ways, I guess. So I think what work went into creating that cultural concept, I guess? How did they arrive? Like, what was the process as a group that they were able to sort of land that? It was just, it sounds like such a powerful strategy. and the principles you talked about around the structure and the talking and connection, and then the love, and it made everyone hold true to the mission, I guess. So amazing work. But yeah, I'm just wondering what was the pre-work into arriving at that? Did you hear from them about that?
Yeah. Kia ora. Thank you, Jane, for joining us today. Yes, no, those are wonderful points. And I think, you know, it's the Tatoua part of this organizing framework that the women really use to their advantage, I think was already sort of there. And if you know anything about Samoan culture, it's very protocols and very specific roles, right, that people have in place in terms of understanding their place and what their roles are. You know, and this is also, you know, even though this is a sort of gendered labor of work that these women are doing, you know, one of the more interesting parts of their work has also been about them recognizing that it's not just a gender relations in terms of male and female bodies doing the work, but it's also about finding balance and not reinforcing hierarchies in the community. Right, so their kind of notion of gendered work was very different from how U.S. conceptualize hierarchies and sexuality and gender. So I thought that was really important, and it kind of reminded me of your question of how they sort of came to Tatoua. And I think part of that kind of finding for them was what they were already doing and what they valued. And I think the women were very keen on understanding the value of Samoan concepts within a Samoan community, right? So how do you use that to put forth a very sort of complicated ideology of educating disabled students in there. And there's some of the women, of course, used much of their, also cited a lot of their Christian religious beliefs around educating students. But I think it was a compilation of understanding the value of community knowledge and resources and concepts in conjunction with I guess, you know, some of the women, since the naivete of them believing that they can create these schools, right? And even if they didn't have the funding and the support to do it, they were going to do it anyway.
Yeah.
Yes, right. So I think that's a kind of, I don't know if it's a kind of essence or attitude that that a lot of these women enacted or implemented, but it's also, I think, a very, I mean, in another forum that I had, I think one of the questions I got was also thinking about this as a nationalistic kind of project, right? And this is sort of coming out of the 70s, and Samoa became a newly independent state from New Zealand. And so I think there's also a lot of sort of decolonial aspects here that I didn't really touch on, that are also part of the attitude and kind of mood of the time with how these women navigated these spaces.
Yeah, so effective. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Other questions from the audience? If not, I'll jump in with another one of my own.
There's one in the chat, Randy.
Oh, okay. I didn't missed it. Sorry. I can't see it. If you want to ask it, whoever that is, I can't, for some reason, I can't see it.
Is it from Marina? I think I see it here.
Yeah, from Marina.
Okay, so I'll read it just for
Great, got it.
accessibility. sakes. So thank you for your presentation. I was wondering if you can share a little bit more on some of the culturally specific practices of care you've seen occur within these schools and the local communities. Oh, that's a good question. Thank you, Marina. Culturally specific practices of care, yeah. I mean, the closest I could think of is the women's using of alofa, which translates, and this is a translation to English, as love. And much of, to kind of go back to Ray's question, much of the caring for disabled people at the time were the responsibilities of the families. So there was really no sort of structural institutions in place around this. So familial care, and of course not so loving care was part of this. Some of the women spoke about how some of the disabled children were treated by some families as non-members of the family, or treated badly as a part of the group. And so there's so many cultural specifics here to thinking about disability, and much of the work and the activism and advocacy that the women were also trying to convey was that there are other options than what we're already doing. So it's kind of the changing of the norm, right? Here's the normal that's been happening, or the status quo that's been happening at the time, and that there are other options. And so it's sort of this educating slash changing of paradigms slash moving to action that was happening simultaneously here, that I think is really also important to kind of flag as we talk about care. But care also is such a broad word, and I use it as care work, right? Like Tatoua and alofa for others is also a kind of responsibility that you don't just have to yourself, but you collectively have to others, to others in terms of person, place, or thing, right? So it's a very kind of broad sense here of care. And of course, today times have changed. There are more services and more programs that are in place to kind of think in a mix of Western notions of care, and also systems and services in place now. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, Marina.
Looks like Ray, you have a follow-up question?
I do, and it kind of continues in this conversation. But I'm curious if then or now, were the programs inclusive? Were students with disabilities being integrated with those with typical students? And or was it more like, well, that's their side there, that's the special ed school over there, and we have our other students over here?
Yeah, thank you for asking. And I think this is sort of one of the findings from this work, is that, so the answer is no. They didn't have any of those things in place at the time. But I think, Ray, you're pointing to one of the other findings from this work, is that which the women were so in tune with, was that just because they created a school for students with intellectual and physical disabilities doesn't mean then that they are sort of out of mind, out of sight by the government in terms of government's resources, right? So there's a very there's a critique there of inclusion and also exclusion of these students. So, and the women said something along the lines of, yeah, you know, they were like, oh, you know, those kids, the disabled kids, they have their school and everything, so they're fine, right? And we don't have to deal with them with any other, we don't have to provide anything else for them because they have their schools. And so I think the point of segregation and inclusion gets lost there, right? Because these students have their schools and it's usually just students with disabilities. They're not, excuse me, they're not interacting with any of their same age peers or non-disabled peers. So it's also segregating in that way, right? It's a sort of a segregated space in that way where they're not exposed to their same age non-disabled peers, which is a big critique in special education, that you know, creating schools for disabled students is one thing, but there also has to be ongoing support to provide them with spaces that are also supportive in their social development. So, and this is where I think, Ray, you're kind of talking about inclusive education, where you have disabled students mainstreamed or integrated into classrooms with non-disabled students, right? So there's a whole nother field called inclusive education that speaks of the kind of critiques and the politics around inclusion of students in classrooms. But in terms of this time in Samoa, there was none of that work. It was really sort of a starting of I think the special education system, if we want to kind of go that way.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. Is there anyone else?
I had a quick question. Is the schools standalone now? Do families have to fund them at all? And are they sort of sustainable? And if so, yeah, first of all, that question.
Yeah. No, so there's been a lot of development with the schools in terms of funding. I mean, that's been the ongoing challenge, is funding the schools consistently. The founders have talked about it. Even some of the founding teachers have talked about how they would work, and then they didn't have any more funding, so they would take a break and fundraise and then come back to teach, because or they would just work without pay. So that is a huge part of this story. And so Lototo Mawhai in the last 5 years has partnered with the Chinese government, and they have built a huge campus, which, if I go back to those two pictures, one is sort of the original campus, which is across the street from the hospital, and then one is sort of a newer campus that was built by the Chinese government about 2-3 years ago. It's beautiful. It's an accessible campus for students. And so I think in terms of funding, they have been more consistently funded through those avenues. And I think Aomawhia Malama is quite the opposite. They're still working sort of at the grassroots, you know, taking donations, applying for grants, whatever they can find from other organizations and units around their networks. And so they're sort of in a more precarious position in terms of school. And I think when and they do a lot of volunteers, so they take in many volunteers from various countries such as Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Canada, the US, who come and volunteer at the school for a certain amount of times. But it really
was that really impacted through COVID? Like, I'm just thinking.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, now, how they go.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think they've even, my last conversation with the current principal was that they even reached out to their retired staff to ask them to come back during COVID to support the schools because the, you know, that sort of rotation of staff and support was impacted during COVID. So yeah.
Well, I want to just say thank you to Dr. Anesi for sharing your time with us and your wonderful insight. I think, you know, we've learned a lot and thank you for, you know, enlarging our world with your great informative research. And thank you to everyone who attended, and have a great rest of your Friday, everyone. Yeah, let's give a round of
Thank you.
applause.